Hello, I'm Perry Clausen, Executive Director of the East San Joaquin Water Quality Coalition. Thanks for taking time to watch this video. Watching this video is part of the requirements when you have a parcel designated as an outlier. The video will cover the details of removing the outlier designation for any parcel listed. Once the video is completed, you'll need to fill out and return to us the Management Practice Implementation Report, or MPIR, which is an inventory of practices for managing nitrogen applications. You can either email a PDF of the survey or drop it by the Farm Bureau offices in Modesto, Merced, or Madera. We've received compliments from members who previously viewed this video saying the agronomists we featured provide useful information for improving nitrogen use efficiencies. First, you'll hear me explain details of the outlier process. While my talk mentions pistachios, the details for all the crops are identical. Then you'll see a video that features Phoebe Gordon with the University of California. Phoebe will cover nitrogen management in pistachios. I'll be back at the end with some important details. Be sure to email us your member ID number after watching.
I want to go through the steps involved in identifying outlier parcels. This is the first year that we're identifying outlier fields for pistachios. Last year we started on almonds. This year we'll do pistachios, walnuts, and wine grapes. So you might ask, why do we have to identify outliers? Well, in 2012, when the fertilizer reporting requirement was adopted by the Regional Water Quality Control Board and accepted by the State Water Board, there was a mandate that we had to identify outliers based on information taken from the Irrigation and Nitrogen Management Plan summaries. So what we have to do is look at the ranges of the applied over the removed that each of those reports indicates and average them over a 3-year period of time. So the terms for developing the target values is not specifically defined, so we came up with a statistical approach that identifies fields that are fertilized outside of the normal range that growers are using for that particular crop. And the method that we use is called a statistical analysis called the interquartile range, which was accepted by the regional board. And if we need to determine a different approach in the future, we will. But for now, this is the approach being used by the coalition in the Central Valley. So this slide shows what's called a bell curve. Many of us have seen those in the past. And what this shows is where the outlier parcels lie based on a comparison to other growers of the same crop. Of course, in this instance, it's pistachios. The top of the curve is where the majority of growers show up in this analysis, whereas the outliers are on the outer right-hand side of the chart, indicating that they are applying more nitrogen than the crop is removing. So what we use to determine an outlier parcel is an average of 3 years of applications of nitrogen compared to that removed component. So the crop nitrogen coefficient is what we call the number. This is a very important indicator of the amount of nitrogen that is removed in yield that is harvested from a field. So the ideal is having little to no excess nitrogen left in the field that might potentially leach to groundwater. And then some crops have good numbers, other crops not so good. So the A over R, or the applied over removed, is really considered a metric for grower performance. It's used to determine the outliers. As I mentioned earlier, those numbers compared over a 3-year period averaged out to determine whether a field is considered an outlier. So as you saw in that earlier graph, we accumulate or average all the A over Rs for all growers in a region for the same crop. So the report that we sent you that identified those parcels as outliers may have incorrect information. So what do you do if you see that maybe you reported the wrong number? Well, first off, contact the coalition. Give us a call, send us an email, and we will look at the records, and you can send a modified crop report, irrigation and nitrogen management plan. We'll have a little document that you sign, a change form that will allow us to change that information in your report. And then what we would ask you to do is provide us your original worksheet from the corrected year, and then we'll have your new corrected form on file if there's ever a question. And then, of course, we'll recalculate the applied over removed to make sure we have that correct information. If the new ratio is calculated to show your parcel is no longer an outlier, then it will be adjusted. So why are we identifying these outlier parcels? When we submit our plans to the regional board for all of our coalition members, it's called a comprehensive groundwater quality management plan. And in that plan, we have to indicate how are we going to make changes to nitrogen applications over a broad area if in fact there is excess applications being made onto these parcels. So in our comprehensive groundwater quality management plan, we have a responsibility for parcels in the high vulnerability areas to identify these parcels that may have excess nitrogen applications. And of course, what happens when there's excess applications, it may cause or contribute to exceedances of nitrate contamination in the groundwater. So if there's excess applications, it can contribute to contamination in the aquifers that would be above the drinking water standard for nitrate. So when a parcel is identified as being an outlier, then we are responsible as a coalition to provide additional outreach and education to growers with an attempt and with the goal of trying to minimize that excess applications to a crop. So this comprehensive groundwater quality management plan is something that enables us to develop an approach to deal with these excess applications and eliminate these potential impairments to groundwater. Now, it may seem like a lot of work to get this done, but what it enables us to do is not have a grower himself individually have that groundwater quality management plan. So we prepare that plan for all the growers in our region that grow specific crops. So we started out with this outlier process last year with almonds. This year we have pistachios, walnuts, and wine grapes. Next year, we're going to be focusing on sweet potatoes, corn, silage, and processing tomatoes. And then in coming years, figs, alfalfa, peaches, and prunes. Now, this year, we're also going back to the almond data, and if there are growers whose 3-year averages indicates an outlier field, then those are added to the outreach and education process that we are now doing with pistachios and the other crops. So the groundwater quality management plan has 5 approaches or 5 steps that we need to take. First, we have to identify potential sources of nitrate contamination in our coalition region. Then we have to provide education to growers on this requirement and also on the management practices that can help minimize these discharges. And then thirdly, we want to encourage growers to adopt these practices. It may seem a little bit punitive to be identifying certain growers, but in fact, what we have found in the past from doing these meetings and having this outreach, there are still areas that growers can learn from in managing their nitrogen applications. And then we continually evaluate the A over R data that we are collecting from growers, so we are able to check and see if there are improvements that are being made. And then, of course, we will be providing you feedback each year on how your parcels rank against other growers of the same crop. So here's the timeline that we're following. We're having these meetings now. We will be tracking your information over time. So after this meeting and you've watched this video, you will have a management practice implementation report to fill out. And this is just a several-page survey on management practices that you are using or may consider using in the future. And then we will come back in 5 years and reassess your progress over that period of time to see if the fields are still ranking in a outlier designation. And if there's no improvements, there is a chance that we may end up having to turn over names to the regional water board, but we're a long ways from that. So how are the outlier parcels identified? We take 3 years of data, and in this case, we're taking 2017, 18, and 19 data, and giving you this report on those outlier parcels. And the designation is specific to a crop, a parcel, and to the member. And it requires the same member farm, the same crop on the same parcel for 3 years in a row. So you're not taking the responsibility of previous landowners or operators in the specific fields. So you now are at this meeting, you have an outlier parcel. What does that mean? Now what? So your responsibilities are, of course, to continue to submit your irrigation and nitrogen management plan. You need to attend this crop-specific workshop, watching it on a video, complete that management implementation report survey, and implement management practices if you find some in this survey that may help you improve your nitrogen management. Or if there are things Phoebe talks about in her upcoming presentation that might help you improve your efficiency, we encourage you to do that. So now we'll have Phoebe Gordon with the University of California talk about the 4 R's: the right time, the right place, the right amount, and the right product. This is an approach that is proven to be very reliable and data-backed, and is a method and a technique that can help us, all of us who fertilize a crop, do a better job managing our nitrogen applications.
My name is Phoebe Gordon. I am the Orchard Systems Farm Advisor for Madera and Merced counties, and I cover everything except for citrus in Madera and stone fruit and figs in Merced, although for the time being I'm temporarily covering almonds and pistachios in Merced County. And I'm going to be talking today about nitrogen fertilization of pistachios. Nitrogen is a difficult nutrient to manage because it can be found in many different forms in soils. Much of nitrogen starts out as organic matter, which is broken down in a process called mineralization into ammonium. And that is converted through soil microbes into nitrate via a process called nitrification. These processes will depend on soil temperatures and how much water is present. Organic matter can be a fairly slow process, being converted from organic matter into ammonium, but nitrification can actually be a fairly rapid process, as short as a few weeks, especially in California conditions where we have warm soils and a lot of irrigation. Because of this, we have a easy way to remember how to think about nitrogen management called the 4 R's. And that's the right rate, right source, right time, and right place. And this can help you think about how to manage your orchard to make sure that you are applying nitrogen when the trees need it, just enough so that they can get a good yield without losing a bunch to leaching, and to make sure that you're applying the form that trees like. Nitrogen is needed by all plants in basically all cells and all functions. This is because nitrogen is a component of DNA, which stores information for the cell, and RNA, which is how cells convert DNA into proteins. It's also a component of amino acids, which are used to make proteins, and all enzymes actually are made of amino acids, so it's very essential in basically all functions of the cell. When you're thinking about fertilization, you want to think about providing just enough to either meet your yield demand in mature trees or to get good growth but not extra vigorous growth in young trees. It's important to understand that trees take up nitrogen when they demand it. So in mature trees, the vast majority of nitrogen goes into the crop, and a small amount does go to supply vegetative growth. In young trees, they, for the most part, are not bearing, or they're not bearing very much nuts, and so most of the nitrogen that you're going to be putting on is going to go to the vegetative growth. You can't really force more growth or more yield with adding more nitrogen because, again, the trees just aren't going to take it up even if it's present in the soil if they don't need it. And it's important to remember that some other things can limit yield. So for instance, on the east side of the San Joaquin Valley, soils are very sandy and boron contents tend to be very low. Boron is essential for getting good yields, and if you don't have enough boron in your pistachio trees, then they will not have a good nut set. You can't force more yield by adding more nitrogen if the limiting factor is boron. Even if you have a well-fertilized, perfectly irrigated field, there's only so much sunlight that these trees can intercept and put into yield and growth. When you apply nitrogen, you're going to be most efficient when you're splitting up your nitrogen applications over as many different sessions as possible. Obviously, there are other things that you need to think about, like the cost and the hassle associated with storing nitrogen on site, but in general, the more applications you can split it up over, the more efficient you're going to be. It's also important to remember that as far as we know, there is no nitrogen uptake when trees are dormant. This is because you need young roots and active root growth to take up nitrogen. Research has shown, at least in almonds, that most root growth happens during the spring and summer, and I see no reason to think that would be different in pistachios. Late applications of nitrogen are also at a higher risk for leaching, and so anything applied during the wintertime, you risk losing it. Something else to keep in mind with pistachios, at least young pistachios, is that high vigor has been connected to winter juvenile dieback, which is also in the past called frost damage. We don't have a lot of hard research-backed data. What we mostly have is anecdotal evidence collected by Craig Carlson and Blake Sandin of Kern County, but it's associated with trees that are with high vigor going into the fall in sodium-affected soils, which keeps them wet, and trees that are on UCB1 rootstock. And so it's important to remember that if you're over-fertilizing your juvenile trees, they have high vigor going into the fall, they might be at a higher risk for winter juvenile dieback. Pistachios are alternate bearing, and there is higher nitrogen uptake in on years versus off years. And the accumulation of that nitrogen does differ between the years. In on years, that nitrogen taken up is put into the yield or the fruit. In off years, there is some accumulation in perennial tissues. And as far as we understand, some of that perennial tissue accumulation in off years is used to help supply the nitrogen demand in on years. So there's also different uptake patterns in on versus off years. Uptake is a little heavier in the spring and an off year, possibly to compensate for a very high nitrogen export during on years. And so that is also going to guide when you might be putting down that nitrogen. So now that we understand a little bit more about the pistachio tree, we can start getting into the 4 R's. So we'll start with the right rate. Pistachios need about 28 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 pounds marketable yield. And so at the beginning of the season, you'll assess what your yield looks like, whether it's an on or off year, and you'll start fertilizing after the trees have leafed out. So it's important to remember that splitting your nitrogen up over as many applications as possible is going to improve your nitrogen use efficiency. In on years, you can split your nitrogen over 20% in the spring flush, 30% during whole expansion, 30% during kernel fill, and 20% at maturity or just past post-harvest. In off years, load that nitrogen up a little earlier in the season. You want to get 50% on before shell hardening, and the rest you can apply over July and August. So you can see suggested rates based on yield in the slide. And just note that this does not account for what is needed for vegetative yield. A little bit more is going to be needed in an off year than an on year. On this slide, we have suggested fertilization strategies for young pistachios. I want to emphasize that we do not have research-backed data. This is based on UC experience. So please use these and use your own judgment when looking at the potential vigor of your young orchard. And do keep in mind that after year 5, your trees might start bearing small amounts, and so these suggested rates do account for that. Now, when trying to figure out the right rate, it's important to remember that just because your trees demand a certain amount of nitrogen does not mean that you're going to be adding that amount of nitrogen. It's also critically important to take into account the amount of nitrogen that you have in your irrigation water, as well as if you have any residual large amounts of nitrogen in your soil. This slide will give you calculations on how to take into account how much nitrogen you might be adding in your irrigation water, as well as what might be in your soil before you start fertilizing. To continue to refine your nitrogen fertilization program, you can use soil sampling, although it's very important to remember that soil samples are a point-in-time picture of what's going on in your orchard. Soil samples are also difficult to perform because in irrigated fields, nitrogen will not necessarily end up in an even distribution in your soil. Make sure to work with your lab and your crop consultant when doing soil sampling to make sure that you get a good distribution of the wetted root zone before sending a sample to the lab. In general, for soil sampling, you should have no more than 40 acres be represented in one soil sample with 8 to 10 sub-samples per sample. So what that means is you get 8 to 10 soil augers, mix them up, very well, take a representative subsample from that, and that's what you send into a lab. You can do more refined sampling if you want, and we do recommend that if your soil has a lot of variation in it. You should sample, for the most part, for regular fertility soil tests in the top 0 to 12 inches, making sure you discard the surface soil, especially if you do a lot of gypsum application to the surface soil. You can do deeper soil samples at the end of your season to see where your nitrogen has ended up to try to refine your fertilization program. Roots are, for the most part, contained to the top 2 feet of soil, so you can sample down to 24 inches. Even though pistachios are phreatophytes, which means that they will do deep rooting if they are able to do so, most roots are in the top 2 feet of soil, and so that's where you should be focusing your nitrogen fertilization program. You should be pulling soil samples at half of the wetted radius of whatever irrigation system you're using, if that's drip or microsprinkler. So that means is, if you have your wetting zone be a perfect circle, you have your microsprinkler emitter here, you should be sampling somewhere out here. With drip systems, especially drip systems on berms, that can be a little bit more difficult because water will tend to run off before infiltrating into the soil. So just do some soil sampling or do some observing to try to figure out where most of that water is landing. That's where most of the water is going to be flowing through, and you want to sample outside of that. When sampling on drip emitters, it can take a little bit of work to try to figure out the best place to soil sample, but the rule of sampling on the outer half of the wetted radius still applies there. The most important feedback for your nitrogen fertilization program is going to be leaf sampling. This is because the ultimate indicator of how well your plants are doing is the plants themselves. There are 2 times to do leaf sampling of pistachios. The main time is your July leaf tissue sample, which is going to give you information on whether or not nitrogen is sufficient, deficient, or excessive, as well as all other nutrients that are critical for good yields, particularly potassium and boron. To leaf sample, you'll be selecting the sub-terminal leaflet that's marked in this slide here from 20 to 30 trees across the orchard. Make sure you spread these samples around. You should be pulling leaves from trees that are at least 30 yards apart. Pick sun-exposed leaves from non-fruiting branches and select leaves from all around the tree. On this slide, you can see deficiency and sufficiency values for pistachios. Just keep in mind that this is for the July leaf sampling timeframe. The July timeframe for sampling leaves was chosen because that's when nutrient values in leaves stabilizes, but it's too late to affect current season's yield. Work done by Patrick Brown's lab from UC Davis has put together early leaf sampling protocols for pistachios. This will allow you to predict your July nitrogen leaf tissue values, but make sure that you also follow up with a July sample because that's how you're going to be refining your potassium and boron fertilization program. The sampling strategy is the same, but you need to make sure that you are going 30 to 40 days after bloom, which is approximately in May. I've spent most of this presentation talking about pistachio physiology so you can understand when to fertilize, so the right time, which is basically when the fruit is developing, and the right rate based on, for the most part, yield. I mentioned that you should be focusing on the top 2 feet of soil since that's where the vast majority of roots are. So that's when you can think about when to try to get the nitrogen to the right place. And so this will, if you're fertigating, it's important to remember to inject the nitrogen in the last half to 3/4 of your irrigation session. Make sure to run some clean water after your injection to make sure it's all flushed out of your irrigation system. It's important to remember that your leaching potential for losing nitrogen to the groundwater is going to be higher in lighter textured soils. In Madera County, for the most part, we have sandy loam soils, and so those can be at a pretty high risk of leaching. We also have some even sandier soils up in Merced County, so just keep in mind that if you're growing in those soil types, you want to be very careful that you are timing your fertigation correctly and making sure that you follow your 4 R's correctly to make sure you're not losing nitrogen through winter rains. As for the right source, The right source can depend on what sort of product you're looking for. If you're looking at cost, if you're looking for other nutrients that might be added in, such as potassium or calcium. It's also important to remember that nitrogen can acidify soils. So if you're in a light textured soil that doesn't have a lot of buffering capacity, you might want to stay away from ammonium containing fertilizers and urea, which will be converted into ammonium, because that can acidify your soil. Just this year, research was funded to try to look at nitrogen uptake curves throughout the season for Golden Hills and Lost Hills, which are two newer pistachio cultivars that alternate bear less severely than Kerman. So we hope to provide more information on uptake timing and when to refine your nitrogen fertilization practices in a few years. If you're looking for more information on nitrogen management in pistachios or farming in general, I have a podcast. My co-host is Luke Milliron up in Butte, Glen, and Tehama counties. And we have an entire nitrogen management series as well as an irrigation management series. You can find it at www.growingthevalleypodcast.com. We also have two websites, one focused on the San Joaquin Valley and the other focused on the Sacramento Valley. And those are Sacramento Valley Orchard Source and San Joaquin Valley Trees and Vines. You can find compiled articles written by UC advisors there. You can find more information on nitrogen management guidelines at the CDFA FREP website. They have a crop fertilization guidelines for pistachios, almonds, walnuts, and other major crops grown in the state.
Well, I hope you found this information useful. Expect nitrogen management to be a front and center issue facing agriculture for years to come. Couple of reminders. Please fill out and return to us the Management Practice Implementation Report, or MPIR, which is an inventory of practices for managing nitrogen applications. Completing the survey is mandatory for remaining a member in good standing. You can either email us a PDF of the survey or drop it by the Farm Bureau offices in Modesto, Merced, or Madera. If you need another copy of the MPIR, request it when you email your confirmation of viewing the video. Finally, make sure you email us your member ID number after watching this video. Thanks again for watching.